U.S.S. President Garfield was heading to China. On board, a middle-aged American stared out to sea. His passport said that he was a farmer, but he wasn't going to look at the land. He was going to look at the sky. His true task was to assess the condition of China's Air Force. His planned 3-month assignment turned into 8 years of warfare. By its end, he would be a major general, and the unit he created, the Flying Tigers, would be the most famous squadron in the history of aerial warfare. Chennault was born in 1893 in Commerce, Texas. His tough face revealed his character, bold, unyielding, and adventurous. But Chennault's spiky personality and disregard of military discipline often made him a thorn in his superiors' sides. Crucially, they did not recognize his brilliance as a tactician. That would come later. Chennault became obsessed with flying while at college. Of farming stock, he studied agriculture at college. But while his roots were on the ground, his heart was in the air. He served as ground crew during World War I and only entered a fighter pilot training program after the war. He advanced quickly, and in 1923, he became commander of the 19th Pursuit Squadron based in Hawaii. It was not a good time to be a fighter pilot. Military theorists claim that bombers were the future of aerial warfare.
It was believed by particularly the American Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force in particular that the major power of their future air forces should be bomber forces. They believed very strongly that future wars would be fought by fleets of heavy bombers, well armed, that could outpace defensive fighters. They believed that fast, big bombers would always get through.
The strategists thought that pursuit planes, known today as fighters, had no future in aerial combat. They said the bomber was the machine to win wars. However, Chennault was an ardent and a stubborn proponent of the fighter.
陈纳德他是在理论上，他认为说杜黑的轰炸机主义论根本就是错误的，因为杜黑认为说轰炸机只要一起飞之后，战斗机根本无法拦截，无法找到他们。那陈纳德对于这个思想他是否决的。
His radical views made him enemies in the high command. He would soon be put to the test. Chennault began to develop his new air battle theory and tactics while he was based in Hawaii. He concluded that formations of fighters were more effective than single planes. In addition to training fighter pilots, Chennault found time to pursue his passion. He organized and flew with an aerial acrobatic team, 3 men on the flying trapeze. In 1936, the aerobatic display team performed in Miami. Mao Bangchu, vice principal of China's Central Aviation School, was in the admiring crowd. After the show, Mao Bangchu invited Chennault to train pilots in China. Initially, Chennault declined. It took a personal letter from an unexpected source to change his mind. The letter came when he was at the low point of his career. His aerial warfare theory had been rejected by his superiors. They wanted him to retire on the grounds of ill health. Yet, he wanted to fly. An invitation from the wife of the President of China, Madame Chiang, offered him new hope. The Chinese government promised him the rank of colonel in the Chinese Air Force with a salary of $1,000 per month plus generous allowances. And most attractively, he was given the right to fly any airplane in the Chinese Air Force. At 4 times his former salary, it was an offer the grounded 44-year-old Chennault found impossible to refuse. A few days later, he began the most important journey of his career. Like many American military officers, Chennault believed that war between America and Japan was inevitable. But before war came, he wanted to see this enemy for himself. Together with his aerobatic teammate, Bill McDonald, he took a month-long tour of the country. With cameras hidden under their coats, they recorded potential military targets. Chennault realized that while his notes and photos were incomplete, they were nevertheless much better than all the intelligence in U.S. Army and Navy documents. Chennault arrived in Shanghai in June 1937. There he met his boss, Madame Chiang. She was the wife of China's leader and, more importantly, the Secretary General of China's Aviation Committee. Madame Chiang called it "My Air Force," both in public and in private. It was more than a term of endearment. In 1936, her husband, China's leader Chiang Kai-shek, was almost killed by his own planes. Since that time, the Generalissimo and his wife maintained personal control of China's Air Force. But they needed Chennault to control China's skies. The blunt pilot from Texas and China's elegant First Lady made an odd couple, but they quickly discovered common ground. Chennault was captivated by the First Lady's elegance, her devotion to building an effective Air Force, and by her accent. Educated in Virginia, Madame Chiang spoke English with a beguiling Southern accent. Chennault was smitten. After their first meeting, the enchanted Texan proclaimed that he would never find inner peace and that thereafter she would be his princess.
因为蒋中正不懂英文，陈纳德不懂中文，那刚好有个宋美龄在中间，沟通起来就容易多了。而且宋美龄又是空军之母，在航空委员会里也有足够的地位。
Madame Chiang and Chennault were kindred spirits. They both believed that air power was crucial. Chennault began his inspection from Nanjing. Then he toured Air Force bases and aviation schools around the country. What he saw depressed him. Chennault discovered for himself just how corrupt and inefficient China's Air Force really was. Gradually, the true status of the Air Force became clear. It was not a pretty sight. In the 10 years since the foundation of the Chinese Air Force, factionalism, corruption, and nepotism had taken their toll. His officers told Chiang Kai-shek that there were 500 aircraft. Chennault's inspection revealed this to be a gross exaggeration. When Chennault reported that there were really just 90 operational aircraft, Chiang threatened to shoot the translator. Only Chennault's timely intervention saved his life. Meanwhile, Japan had 3,000 aircraft, 400 of which were based in Shanghai alone. In terms of quantity and quality, China's Air Force didn't stand a chance against its enemy. Chennault concluded that their inadequate training and obsolete aircraft made the Chinese pilots sitting ducks, ill-prepared for battle. The timing couldn't be worse. On July 7, 1937, before Chennault had even completed his report, gunfire at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing lit the spark that would consume China for 8 bitter years. 10 days later, Chiang Kai-shek made an important speech in front of Chinese and foreign journalists. He said, "China has been driven to the impasse. It is time to take action. The war had begun. Chiang's expression was determined, but he grabbed his hat and stood there, not knowing what to do with the catastrophe just around the corner. Chennault was on an inspection tour when war was declared. He immediately offered his services to China. He needed China as much as China needed him. Chennault needed an opportunity to test his theory of aerial warfare. China desperately needed him to recognize its Air Force. His 3-month tour as temporary advisor was over. An 8-year career as commander had begun. Chennault was the first foreigner to actively request to join the battle after the outbreak of the war with Japan. Chennault's first task was to complete his assessment of the war readiness of the Chinese Air Force.
他在抗战爆发初期呢，在庐山受蒋委员长召见的时候，他就讲过，空军虽然说有500架飞机在账目上，但其实只有91架可以做实际作战。那相反的话，日本人呢，陆军航空队的数量大概是1480架，海军的话是1220架。
Chiang was furious, but he respected Chennault's honesty. Chennault earned himself a reputation of being realistic and practical. What's more, he earned Chiang's trust. He was one of the few people who could speak the truth in front of Chiang at any time. Chiang Kai-shek kept faith in him throughout the entire war. It became the solid foundation for Chennault to stay in China and realize his ambition. Japan launched an all-out attack on Shanghai on August 13, 1937. China's coastal cities were bombed mercilessly. Bombers were the key to Japan's offensive. They believed there was no need to escort high-speed, heavily armed bombers with fighters. They could rampage in China's sky as they pleased. Except Chennault had a plan. Fighters, especially China's obsolete fighters, couldn't catch fast-moving bombers. But what if the defending fighters were already in the air, waiting for the enemy bombers to arrive? Chennault helped the Chinese create bamboo radar, an air attack early warning network. At the same time, he taught Chinese pilots how to use fighter formations against Japanese bombers. Vindication was immediate. In the next 3 bombing raids, 54 Japanese aircraft were shot down. On August 14th, the 4th Group of China's Air Force shot down 6 bombers without any loss. Thereafter, that date was known as China's Air Force Day. The star pilot, Liu Zhuigang, was good at putting Chennault's tactics into practice. In the first 2 days, he got 3 bombers. Chennault said Liu was his prize student. After all his years in the wilderness, Chennault had proved the value of his tactics. One Japanese battle report went so far as to conclude that Japanese bombers were no match for Chinese fighters. It was Chennault that made the Japanese realize what a big mistake they had made. As a reward, Madame Chiang gave Chennault a special gift. It was his own personal fighter, a Curtiss P-36 Hawk. She paid over $50,000 for it. Chennault flew it to observe air battles between China and Japan. He also investigated the activities of Japanese warships in the Yangtze River and troops along its banks. It was even rumored that Chennault used it to shoot down 30 Japanese planes. Of course, at that time, Chennault was in China as a non-combatant advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. Even if he did engage in combat with the Japanese, he could never admit it. No one knows for sure whether Chennault shot down Japanese fighters, but we do know the name of the first American airman to attack Japanese aircraft in China's skies. His name was Robert Short. Years before war was declared, he was an instructor for Boeing. In February 1932, he was demonstrating Boeing's latest fighter in Suzhou. When Japanese bombers attacked the city, he selflessly flew to its defense. He knocked one bomber out of action before being shot down by 3 Japanese fighters. The Chinese government posthumously made him a captain and raised a monument in his honor. With China and Japan officially at war, Chennault's actions drew Japanese attention. The Japanese government complained to Washington, demanding that Chennault and other U.S. instructors leave China.
Well, the Japanese hated him. Even as early as 1937, they actually had a $25,000 bounty on his head, which $25,000 in 1937 was a lot of money.
The U.S. government was reluctant to join foreign wars. Sanctions were in place to stop U.S. citizens involving themselves in foreign war. Americans in China were specifically prohibited from cooperating with the Chinese government in any military activities. Following their government's orders, some American trainers left China. Chennault didn't flinch. He would only leave when the last Japanese was driven from China. But he did lower his profile, at least for a while. After their big losses above the Yangtze River Delta, Japanese aircraft returned to Nanjing. And this time, they brought something new: advanced Mitsubishi Type 96 bombers and Nakajima Type 97 fighters to escort them. These planes were far superior to any in the Chinese arsenal. In the first day's battle, China lost 11 out of 16 aircraft. From then on, Japanese planes flew to Nanjing every day, shooting down more and more irreplaceable Chinese planes. Japan quickly seized control of the air over Nanjing, Shanghai, and most of the cities in eastern China. Chiang Kai-shek's first wife, Ma Fu-mei, was killed in the bombing. His second wife, Madame Chiang, appealed to the free world for aid in the defense of China.
Death comes from the clear blue sky, just as it has come to thousands of our innocent people throughout the length and breadth of our land. You have seen in the pictures, and you have read of the destruction of homes and the terrible slaughters being carried out by the Japanese throughout our country, wherever their bombers could fly.
But to China's dismay, the eruption of a full-scale war only made U.S. and U.K. neutrality laws bite harder. To avoid friction with Japan, they stopped selling military supplies to China. China could not replace planes lost in battle. By the end of October in 1937, there was nothing really left in the Air Force. The best pilots had been killed, and there were only 12 aircraft left. Without aircraft and pilots, Chennault could do nothing to help the Chinese Air Force to fight. While Chennault's hands were tied, help came from an unexpected quarter. Showing more than just moral sympathy, the Soviets provided financial and military support. The Soviet Union sent to China both planes and pilots to fly them. They were called the Soviet Volunteer Group. While China appealed to all nations to help against the Japanese aggressor, the Soviets were the first to provide material aid. Of course, the Soviets had their own agenda. Ideological differences between Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek were pushed aside. Following the principle of "my enemy's enemy is my friend," the Soviets provided vital men and equipment. The Soviets were badly in need of anyone who could weaken Japan and ease the Japanese imperialist threat to their own country. The Soviets were badly in need of anyone who could weaken Japan and ease the Japanese imperialist threat to their own country. They sent 4 fighter squadrons and 2 bomber squadrons of their most advanced planes, as well as over 2,000 pilots and crew.
他们全部穿便服的。 只要飞行的时候穿飞行服，平常的是便服不跟中国人接触的。因为中国国民党还是国民党嘛，他还是共产党嘛。
The first batch joined the battle to defend Nanjing. There was nothing Japan could do to stop them. Before long, the secret was out. The Soviet volunteer group was on everyone's lips. Japan was frightened because there was nothing they could do to stop the Soviet participation. From 1937 until 1941, the Soviet Union supplied China with over 1,200 aircraft and helped to train Chinese pilots. It was the most difficult time for Chinese Air Force. Without the equipment supplied by the Soviets, the Air Force would have collapsed. Despite the Soviets' insistence on their own way to fight, Chennault, as the advisor to China's Air Force, sometimes discussed battle plans with the Soviet commander and Chinese leaders. Chennault spoke highly of the Soviet volunteer group, proclaiming that they were extremely tenacious and energetic, never tired of battles, and able to withstand round-the-clock operations.
是在由陈纳德他看了苏联人的一些战术之后，他又产生了一些灵感，包括苏联人会互相掩护，他们会用 I-16战斗机去俯冲日本的飞机，他就知道说可以靠这种俯冲攻击的方式去跟灵活的日本飞机缠斗。已经是一个本人。
April 29th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito's birthday, was always celebrated by a festival. Chennault had a hunch that Japanese airmen would launch an intensive air raid as a gift for their emperor. So he suggested that the Soviet volunteer group and a Chinese Air Force set a trap. The day before, all the Soviet and Chinese aircraft pretended to fly out, creating a false impression that there were no aircraft left to defend the city. But after an hour, all the aircraft secretly came back. The Japanese took the bait. On the 29th, escorted by 24 fighters, 15 bombers attacked Wuhan. Chinese aircraft were waiting for them. Although 11 of them were shot down, the Japanese still had to confront another 40 Soviet aircraft on their return to base. The sun was on the Soviets' backs. In 30 minutes, 36 enemy aircraft were shot down. Just 3 escaped. Japan suffered its worst loss since the invasion. Chennault thought it was the most brilliant air battle he had ever seen, a masterpiece of planning and execution. Soviet pilot Grigory Kary-Timoshenko's grave is located in Xishan Park, Chongqing. He was a group captain in the Soviet volunteer group. His aircraft was damaged in the defense of Wuhan. When his plane was hit by enemy fire, he fought to keep it from populated areas. He crashed in the Yangtze River and drowned. He was buried by the local Chinese. With Soviet support, China's Air Force survived. Japan's monopoly in the sky was broken, forcing them to move their airfields far from the front lines.
没有他们那个援助，中国这几年了就完了。你不管怎么看观想，苏联的志愿那个飞行员来中国啊，有些打了3次4次，等于轮换训练，所以中国苏联来中国的飞行员啊，死了不少。
The Soviet aid came at a critical time for China. 236 Soviet airmen sacrificed their lives in China.
但是随着时间慢慢这样下来，中国空军所能训练的人员和所有的这个飞机硬体都已经受到相当程度的损伤。虽然跟苏联合作，苏联也援助了一些飞机，苏联也派了飞行员过来帮助中国作战，但是那个在数量上、程度上飞机的性能上都还是不能够跟日本相比的。所以到了1940年之后，中国的领空基本上就是日本的天下。
The situation again became desperate. 1940 was a tense year for Europe. Anticipating war with Germany, the Soviets gradually recalled their volunteer group. It was a prescient move. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. In the first 9 days, the Soviets lost 4,614 airplanes. So complete was the catastrophe that the Soviets stopped aiding China and withdrew the last of their volunteers. China again faced the abyss. Madame Chiang and Chennault both understood that for China to keep fighting, its air force must be rebuilt and strictly trained according to Chennault's standard. Chennault established a fighter training school in Zhejiang. 2 months later, Chennault and the school moved to Kunming in southwest China. Chennault ended up staying in Kunming much longer than in any other Chinese city. He called it his second home. China's new Air Force Officer School was at Kunming's Wujaba Airfield, next to Dian Lake. It was staffed by a dozen former U.S. Army Air Force officers. According to Chennault, his students were strong young men, excellent pilots, eager for action. Together they would build a modern Air Force in China. But that was a long way off. It takes time to train fighter pilots. But time was the one thing China didn't have. What it needed was pilots who could immediately join the battle. Chennault had tried to get pilots for years. In Christmas 1939, he visited America. At that time, he sent information he had collected on Japan's Air Force to a U.S. Army Air Force intelligence officer. It included a detailed report on the new Nakajima Type 97 fighter. His report was returned, rejected. The American analysts refused to believe the Japanese could make such an advanced plane. But in fact, just before he came back, Chennault had first-hand experience of the impossible fighter. Chennault also applied to be reinstated in the U.S. Army Air Force. That too was rejected. Frustrated at home, Chennault returned to China at the beginning of 1940. For him, the sky in China was much wider. There he could at least fly as he wanted, and he could put his theories into practice. His decision was proved correct. A huge opportunity awaited him in China. In 1940, Japanese aircraft ran wild in China's sky, raining down destruction on the defenseless population. After the Soviets' withdrawal, there was nothing to stop them. While Japan had more than 800 fighting aircraft, there was barely anything left of Chinese Air Force. Japan carried out wanton bombing on southwest China. Chongqing, the wartime capital, was brutally hit. During the first 6 months of bombing, Japan dropped 350,000 tons of bombs. That's equal to 1/3 of the total amount of bombs dropped on Japan during the entire war. The conflagration was enormous. Because Chinese houses were made of wood and bamboo, half the city was in ruins. Chennault was in Chongqing during the bombing, but he didn't hide in the shelters. Instead, he stood outside studying the Japanese aircraft and their tactics. While his own country rejected his theories, he would put them to good use in China. But he still needed pilots and planes to put them into practice. Ironically, he got them from the very country that rejected him, the United States. But China was not the only country in the queue for aid. Most of Europe had fallen to Nazi Germany. Only Britain and the Soviet Union remained unconquered, and they too clamored for American supplies. By the end of 1940, President Roosevelt was devising ways to get around the neutrality laws. He stressed that isolation was no longer an option for America. Having just won his third presidential election and wanting to support China and Britain, in December 1940, Roosevelt appealed to the Congress, proclaiming that America must be the great arsenal of democracy. Japan's never-ending savage bombing brought huge pressure on the Chinese government. Chiang Kai-shek knew that morale would falter if Japan continued unopposed in the air. What he needed was America's best fighter planes. He ordered his envoy in Washington, TV Song, to get them. And he asked Chennault to return to America to do everything possible to get planes and pilots for China. Chennault and Mao Bangchu, chief commander of China's Air Force, joined at TV Song in Washington. These were desperate times. The situation in the Far East was deteriorating rapidly. With the defeat of France in Europe, Japan seized the French colonies in Southeast Asia, simultaneously threatening China with war on a new front and threatening British and American interests in Asia. But America wasn't ready for war. It tried to buy time by letting China hold Japan. In December 1940, Roosevelt announced a $100 million loan to China and ordered relevant government departments to work out a military aid plan.
At this point in 1940, he's got the restrictions of a Congress that's not going to support it, with an American public that is not going to support it. But he said, no, we must support China.
Chennault tried to help America prepare for war. This time, he provided it with original intelligence about Japan's most advanced fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M. The world would soon know it by another name, Zero. But he was again ignored. The Zero was Japan's newest fighter. Appearing in 1940, it was one of the most extraordinary airplanes of the war. Famous for its rapid rate of climb, high speed, and extreme maneuverability, the Zero could best any plane then in the air. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was all but unbeatable in a dogfight. Earlier in the year, it had all but blown the Chinese Air Force and the Soviet volunteers out of the sky. On September 13th, 27 Japanese bombers, escorted by 13 Zero fighters, attacked Chongqing. 30 Chinese Air Force fighters waited for them over Bishan. In the ferocious battle, 27 Chinese fighters were shot down. Japan lost none.
失败原因就在于说，日本把它新锐的04战斗机投入战场上去。那我们空军的苏联制，我们那个时候都用苏联制的115、116，已经没有能力再跟那么灵活，然后航程又那么远的飞机作战了。大概在 B3空战，913 B3空战，我们就死了10个人，10个飞行员都是国家精英。
It was a complete shock for the nationalist government. Chiang Kai-shek was angry at his useless Air Force. The Zero became famous after this battle.
这只有啊，这个也不算中国打的人还是很认真的，这个飞机不如人家嘛，比不上零式飞机啊。零式飞机当时富航那个中岛试行了轻轰炸机来炸成都的嘛。原来事前啊，一炸过太平机场，有一架飞机啊，日本飞机降落。 那个日本飞机来前警报啊，机场那个旁边啊插了红的红旗啊，小红旗，它降落以后把红旗拔掉就飞回去，还有这个事情了嘛？好像这样，都中国没什么飞机打了的时候好惨的，那个真的有歧视啊！他把那红旗拿掉了，上飞机就走了。
However, the U.S. military had no record of this most advanced fighter in the world until the attack on Pearl Harbor. At that time, America thought Japan lacked the capacity to build a modern air force.
The American military had very little respect for the Japanese military. They didn't believe the hard intelligence that General Chennault was supplying them. They didn't believe there'd be a fighter plane like a Zero with a 1,000-mile range with its speed and maneuverability.
Even more arrogantly, Americans believed that even if the Japanese had the planes, they couldn't fly them.
Most Westerners thought they were squinty-eyed, they had buck teeth. A lot of the propaganda was the Japanese couldn't follow you into the sun because they squinted and they couldn't see.
The Americans thought that the Japanese had neither the planes nor the pilots to conduct a war. They would pay a heavy price for their arrogance. At the beginning of 1941, Chennault submitted a detailed plan for creating the American Volunteer Group. He claimed that if China could be provided with planes and pilots from the U.S., air power alone would be able to destroy the Japanese invader.
Give me 100 planes, 200 planes, 300 planes, and we'll fight the Japanese to a standoff. This was a pipe dream, but it was very attractive.
But sometimes dreams come true.
Part of the complication was, of course, the U.S. was officially neutral. Although China was at war with Japan, the United States was not at war with Japan, and nor was the United States ready to go to war with Japan. So providing China an advanced, what was hoped for, an advanced air force, or at least part of an advanced air force, would be an indirect way or covert way of fighting Japan without committing the United States prematurely to a war.
Inspired by Roosevelt, the Department of State, the Army, the Navy, and the Treasury Department agreed to tie down Japanese troops within China by providing China with air aid. It came in the form of 100 P-40 fighters. They were America's first modern fighters and were the first American planes to fight Japanese fighters in China's sky. In April 1941, the first batch of P-40s were shipped from New York Harbor. They were sent via Rangoon, Burma. Only 99 arrived in Rangoon because one plane was accidentally dropped into the water during loading. Now they had planes, but no pilots. Chennault and TV Sung tried to recruit pilots from the U.S. military, but were blocked by the U.S. military commanders. Chennault was rudely told, no pilots, no crew. The recruiting team was thrown off U.S. military bases. It took direct intercession by President Roosevelt to break the deadlock. He authorized U.S. servicemen to resign their commissions so that they could fight in China. Their true mission was kept under wraps. The pilots and aircrew went to China undercover. Their contract said that they worked for Camco, a civilian aviation company. The details of their employment were not specified. Their real mission was to fly P-40s in China, fight the Japanese, and defend the Burma Road and cities in southwest China. And there was a bonus. Unofficially, they were told that the Chinese government would pay a bounty of $500 for every Japanese plane shot down. Pilots were not the only target. If the AVG wanted to operate as an independent Army group, it had to recruit mechanics, armorers, radio operators, meteorologists, administrators, even doctors, nurses, and pastors as well.
The contract basically stated that they would be allowed to resign their commissions in the Army, the Navy, or the Marine Corps for 1 year, with the understanding that they would re-enlist at their prior rank and continue on in their service. Payment was very good. They would be making more than three times their normal base pay or flight pay as lieutenants or ensigns in their respective services.
The contract terms were extremely attractive. $250 per month for secretaries, mechanics, and ground crew, and up to $750 for pilots. Compared to that, Air Force pilots in the U.S. only got about $200, mechanics just $100. The combination of a good salary and adventure appealed to many American pilots.
Some of them even knew what they were getting into, but it was something to do. It was a new experience. It gave them a chance to apply their skills, their flying skills, and a lot of them didn't like being under the military, being under the thumb of the military.
So, as young and dedicated and loyal as we were, China, my God, we're looking forward to go to China more than anybody else was. So we signed up, and it wasn't too long later we got called in and had an honorable discharge for us.
After signing their contracts, the new recruits were given train tickets to San Francisco. Once assembled there, they boarded a ship for Burma.
We went on board the ship. We were all supposed to be sort of incognito. And around San Francisco, we didn't go out there as pilots. We went out as a whole bunch of different things.
I think I was supposed to be a plantation manager of what, I don't know, but that was just simply a ploy, I guess, by the State Department to try to cover up the idea that we were going over to get into trouble with the Japanese.
And I remember my uncle came down to see me off. And I heard later he turned to my mother and he said, "We'll never see that boy again."
I remember shedding a few tears when I told my mother and dad goodbye. But I felt good about it, and I told them I'd write them.
On July 10, 1941, the first volunteers set off from San Francisco. Their mission didn't stay secret for long. A Japanese radio station announced their intention to sink the ship.
And from Hawaii, we were out one night, and then all of a sudden everything slowed down. And we looked there, and there was two heavy cruisers, one on each side of us. The Northampton on one side and the Salt Lake City on the other.
The U.S. Navy escorted the valuable cargo across the Pacific. Chennault had done the impossible. Although he was disappointed at the small number of planes and pilots, he at last had an Air Force under his own command. He wrote in his diary that night that for the first time ever, he got what he needed to defeat the Japanese. He was going to show the world how fighters could rule the sky. And he'd start with the AVG in China.